Welcome back to my art channel. I've been on a quest to update my watercolor palette lately. And today I'll dive into a very limited and dark color palette. Grab a snack, your drink of choice, I have hot coffee because it's snowing and storming outside, and your own sketchbooks. Let's start drawing. The set of colors I'm trying out is by Daniel Smith, the Nicolas Lopez artist set. It's a collection of 10 watercolor tubes. The small 5 ml size, so perfect for trying out new colors. I filled this tiny palette with the paints from that set a couple days ago, so now they are dry and ready to use. I only had 8 pans here, not the 10 that should be in the set. Those two missing colors, Piemontite Genuine and Lunar Black, were already part of my collection, so I had told my friend there was no need. Though as I was about to start testing this color selection, I decided to add the two colors anyway, so that they'd be close by and I'd get the full experience without having to reach for another palette. The artists curating these color selections surely put a lot of thought into which paints to include, and I wanted to respect that vision for these first color experiments. As I mentioned in my large art haul video, a friend and I decided to share some watercolor sets like this, as we both wanted to shake up our old watercolor palettes, and this gave us a wider range of options. The small tubes are perfect for this tiny color palette, but even my large tube of Lunar Black didn't put up too much of a fight. This is my favorite black, and no watercolor palette can, to me, be complete without it. Do you have specific shades that you love like that? Keep an eye on those Lunar Black color swatches, as they'll create the most beautiful granulation patterns when dry. I really enjoy making swatch sheets. Depending on the size and paper type, colors can look very different, as granulation and color shifts might be more or less visible. And especially for these heavily granulating colors here, it really makes a difference. At first, when my friend showed me her selection of a color set, I was a bit weary. It looked very monotonous and dark, after all. And what was that random shade of lavender supposed to be? I'd heard a lot about Moonclow, had it recommended to me by multiple people at this point, and it didn't disappoint. A purple with hints of blue and black that creates really unique, distinct crater shapes in its granulation. Bloodstone Genuine was another surprise. Instead of just brown, this looks like several reddish-brown hues and a deeper gray all granulating into each other. Piemontite is a shade we already own from trying out the Primatech colors, but now there's one for each of us, and as a more granulating burnt sienna alternative, it's probably one I'll be using a lot. Lunar Blue, which in my mind was a companion to Lunar Black, creates these beautiful granulations, though more similar to Moonclow than the grainy effect of Lunar Black. But the color that really blew me away was Cascade Green. This one looks like an intense viridian turquoise at first, but dries with hues of warmer grass green, too. The lavender, well, while swatching, I was still a bit puzzled by its inclusion here. But you'll see me figure out multiple uses for it as I paint. Ultramarine Blue, well, it's a classic. I own an ultramarine in pan form, and I'd wanted this basic shade for some of my travel palette setups to have more versatility. Payne's Gray is a cooler and not granulating variation of all these dark tones. Then finally there's the Chinese White. I've been trying to not use white gouache to save or correct my watercolor sketches, as I've become very reliant on it. instead of just taking advantage of the luminous and transparent watercolor properties by themselves. So I'm actually not quite sure how much I'll be using this one. When using limited color palettes, it can be very helpful to make mixing tests like these, or full mixing grids if you're feeling fancy. I went with a couple color triad tests here to see if I could find any mixes that stood out to me. Immediately I'm gravitating to mixes of ultramarine with any of the granulating shades. The Piemontite mixes really beautifully with a lot of different colors, including the ultramarine blue, to create a neutral tone. But this is where the lavender shade stood out to me for the first time, as it creates a muted mauve shade when mixed with the Piemontite. So let's see how these colors perform for someone who usually craves control. For my first sketch with this limited palette, I went with a motif that fits it instead of trying to push the boundaries. A picture of the Jeju seaside with volcanic rock formations and green forests on islands in the background. Keeping it pretty simple at first. The sky showed another use for that lavender shade. It mixes a beautiful gradient with ultramarine blue, so that instead of going from ultramarine to the white of the paper, you have this more violet, radiant transition shade to bring variety. The lunar blue shifts and granulates beautifully on its own, so I just let it do its thing. Same for the bloodstone genuine as a base for the volcanic rocks. The Piemontite genuine is more vibrant than the bloodstone, so these two layer and interact beautifully. I read up on Nicolas Lopez's intention for this set. He wanted to include colors that can generate textures just on their own, that are unpredictable and surprising. Then combined those with foundation colors that don't granulate to support those more experimental paints. It's about embracing the language of water, which I found a beautiful quote and sentiment, so I'll try and keep that in mind for my own sketches. I wish I'd taken a closer look at Nicolas Lopez's work before embarking on my little studies here. His art creates such dramatic light and shadow. I really recommend you take a look at his paintings. His approach to painting is much more expressive, experimental, loose and intuitive than mine. So let's see how these colors perform for someone who usually craves control. As you can see, I'm using some tiny brushes here. The Escoda Ultimo are my favorite watercolor brushes. Even the smallest ones still have a slight mop shape that properly holds water. The size 2 is perfect for small studies like these and for working in sketchbooks. The paper not being stretched and taped makes me reach for smaller brushes and less water overall to avoid too much warping. Though I have to say, with all my wet on wet and color layering here, the Hahnemühle sketchbook is holding up incredibly well. Especially considering that there's already a painting on the other side of this page. I switched to the size 0 of the Escoda Ultimo to carve out some details. I tried to keep the quote from earlier in mind, embrace the language of water. Even on this tiny format, which has less room for flowing textures. I was worried all these different granulating colors would conflict with each other or overwhelm each other, but I found the balance worked out really naturally. The cascade green is a bit too turquoise for some of Jeju's nature, but that subtle warmer green that comes out after the color has dried makes it more harmonious. I've also found that Moonglow and Payne's Grey are perfect for neutralizing other colors. Now, what would you need to make this color palette a more complete mixing set? I think the only shade I'd need to go for a more naturalistic representation of that reference, instead of the moody look of this curated color selection, is a yellow ochre or raw sienna. That would mix warmer green tones with the ultramarine blue and cascade green and get us some of the earth tones for beaches, dry grass, rocks hit by sunlight. So I gave that a test. I don't have a yellow ochre in tube form, but there's this Rotterdam raw sienna, Sienna Natur, that's been a staple in my palette for a long time. All of these brands have amazing artist-grade watercolors, so a lot of it comes down to personal taste. This shade just looks pleasing to me with the perfect amount of warmth. To me, this looks like caramel. As a non-granulating shade, I think this would be a great fit for this already very texture-rich palette. I created this little mixing chart with the Cascade Green, Lunar Blue and Piemontite Genuine. Then, just to see how a slightly more vibrant yellow would work, I used the Quinacridone Gold, another favorite shade, this one by Daniel Smith, to do the same, and also replace the Piemontite with my Burnt Sienna. That brings some bright oranges to the palette, and I think with just either one of these yellowish shades, and maybe a burnt sienna if you often paint portraits or warm sunlit landscapes, you'd have a pretty complete color palette, while still keeping the distinct character of that moodier, granulating selection. Personally, I'd probably just add the raw sienna, as it fits in more harmoniously without overpowering any of the original shades. I kept to just the original color selection for my second test here though. This scene is from a visit to a park here on Jeju, and I wanted to see if I could show a hint of sunlight and blue skies instead of the previous overcast one. Did you notice that I'm finally filling that first sketchbook page? I'd sketched a few character portraits on the next spread during a trip to Seoul over the holidays and completely forgot about the first page. A variety of color swatches, mixing tests and limited palettes seems like a good fit. A page to greet me whenever I open this sketchbook. By the way, if you enjoy my experiments in watercolor, please give this video a like. I'm getting reacquainted with this old favorite medium, so let me know if you'd like to see more sketches and color studies, or maybe even a complete watercolor illustration in the future. My main medium, acrylics, are honestly a bit of a pain to film, as I have to focus on working quick to get ahead of the short drying times, and I really enjoyed making these more watercolor-focused sketchbook sessions, as they are just as calming to film as they are to paint. While of course the result is more muted than the bright red and green of my reference, I do really enjoy how the palette flows together for a cohesive painting, and how these two sketches look next to each other. I need to learn to let the color palette guide me, instead of wanting to wrangle it into my idea of realism, and it's honestly very freeing to just go with the flow, to listen to the water and the paint. The Chinese white can shift the look of certain paints here. It seems to keep the warmer undertone of the Cascade Green from coming out, leaving behind a lighter turquoise, perfect for the traditional colors of Korean architecture. After getting a feel for my color palette, I dove into what I love most, portraiture. I'd recently seen Nosferatu, and the cinematography has etched itself into my brain, so here's another Ellen. I started with just Moonglow. This palette invites you to look at shadow shapes, to slowly build up darkness. If you've ever used violet paint in your portraits, you probably understand why I love this. It's usually an amazing shadow shade, keeping some warmth instead of a harsher, cooler shadow. This is where the lavender shines. It's a pastel, light companion to Moonglow and can build these subtle shades for her face that look like porcelain. I then also really loved how the Piemontite behaved in there. I used it to hint at warmth, just dropping some into those shadows so that this isn't just a monochrome study of light and dark. If you've ever seen the color zones of the face, that explains where I use the Piemontite and where I leave it out. The center of the face is where we can see the red of our veins shine through the skin. It's where we flush and generally where the most saturation looks natural. As I went on, well, this became one of my favorite sketches of late. This palette really kept my sketching style loose. I had to let go of control and the urge to add detail to everything. If you're like me, often a bit hesitant and overly controlled in your paintings, this might be a great selection of colors for you, whether you buy them individually or as a set. The different levels of granulation mesh so beautifully, without ever looking messy or dirty. It leans into the strength of watercolors as a medium, and as someone who usually paints in acrylics exactly because she craves control and opaque layers, this is a wonderful balance to that painting style. What do you think? Is this a set that would suit your own art? Or maybe, like for me, contrast with it to bring a new angle to your sketches? I'm really intrigued by this collection. The Cascade Green is an instant new favorite, and I'm curious to see how painting with this and an additional raw sienna or quinacridone gold will feel in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again in my next art video.